Alright guys, we have news that the next UR character is going to be Bokuto, which a lot of us already knew ahead of time. But actually let's talk about it because he is definitely a bit of a fan favorite, so I know a lot of people probably do want to get a copy of Bokuto. However, we all know that there will be an SP version Bokuto coming in the future as well. And he actually have a totally different kit to how the UR one is going to work. So let's actually take this video to actually compare the two characters and actually talk about what are the pros and cons of the both characters. Okay, now I am going to tell you straight off that the SP1 is going to have higher raw stats. So if power is like literally the only thing you care about, then yes, the SP1 is going to be better than the UR1. However, their kit is completely different, and that's going to have an impact in terms of team play style as well. So I still do think it's actually quite important to understand their play style, because sometimes even though this SP1 may be stronger on paper, the play style could actually be difficult or not actually something you want to build a team around, in which case you may actually end up preferring the UR1 because it's just a bit simpler. Okay, so I will talk all about that in this video. Now, before actually talking about the characters themselves, it's also important to know that both version Bokuto is very heavily centered around team morale system. So let's actually talk about the basic team morale so that we actually have an understanding of how it works normally, and then how would either version Bokuto actually affect that, okay? So how is the normal morale system work? So basically you get different points or morale points, I'm just going to call it here, whenever you do an action in this game. So basically any kind of touch point is going to give you 6 points. So regardless whether that's a spike, a receive, a set, whatever, right, they're all going to give you 6 points. If you have actually won that rally as well, then it's going to give you an extra 10 points. If you lost that, it's going to give you 30 points, so even more. And then you only need 120. Once you actually build up 120, you can basically activate it and enter this team morale stage. And when you're in that stage, you're going to get 20% buff to all of your stats, and it's going to last for 8 net crossing, okay? During that time, you will still be building up your morale, but obviously it wouldn't actually count towards your next morale point, because as soon as the 8 net crossing finish, your morale will drop back to 0, and then you need to build up to 120 points again before you are then able to activate it. Now, I know this is kind of all of the numbers of how you can, add up those, and also when you can actually get to 120. And obviously how the speed of when you can enter is going to depend on how long the rally lasts for, etc. But as a general rule of thumb, it normally takes about 2 rallies, roughly around 2 rallies, before you're then able to actually get into team morale. Obviously, there are also characters with skills that can further boost team morale, especially a lot of the Fukurodani members, they're able to do that, so you may actually get it even faster in those cases. But normally, I would say a rough rule of thumb is about 2 rallies, and then you can enter team morale, okay? Now let's talk about the actual characters themselves. So I'm not going to read out the full kit. You know I never read out full kit of characters on my channel because I trust you guys can read it yourself, okay? So I will share the link in the video comment section. You guys can open that website and read the kit yourself at your own leisure. What I'm going to do is I'll just simply summarize it across 4 different components, which is going to be how does the either version Bokuto actually affect team morale, what happens when you're actually in team morale, what happens when you're actually in the emo mode, because just like the original series, Bokuto is going to have massive mood swing in this game. So basically you have the hype mode, which is when you're actually in team morale, but there's also going to be the emo mode, which is basically when you're going to have like a severe debuff on your character, and therefore you won't be able to perform as strongly. And then lastly, I'll also talk about the dupes, because the dupes are actually quite important for both of the characters. It does give them a massive buff, so it's also important to pay that into consideration when deciding whether you want to summon for one of them, okay? So let's start off with UR version Bokuto. So first of all, morale. How does he actually affect your morale system? So every single touch point you're going to do now is going to give you 4 extra. So before it's only going to be 6, now it's going to be 10. Your rally won, rally lost, those are not going to be affected. And what that normally means is that it, roughly speaking, is probably 30 to 50% faster or accelerated in terms of how fast you're able to quickly build up 120 to get to team morale. Because also whenever he uses ult, he can also get an extra 60 morale as well, okay? Now, when you're actually inside team morale itself, rather than the usual 20% buff for 8 net crossings, now it's going to be 40% buff for 4 crossings. Now, this 40% buff is taken at a higher skill level. If your skill is only level 1, because your Bokuto is only at 0, this will be lower. But I just took the highest number just so you know what he's capable of, okay? Now, just looking at this, hopefully you already know the way your Bokuto is going to be played, because the whole idea behind him is that you'll be quickly getting in and out of team morale all the time, okay? Every single touch you do is going to give you extra morale. When you do an ult, you're going to get extra morale, so you can quickly enter it. And then once you're actually inside him around, because it only lasts for 4 crossings, you'll be quickly out of it straight away, okay? So in the whole match, when you play your Bokuto, your whole team will just be constantly going in and out of team morale all of the time. Now, what happens when you actually incite him around? So when you actually incite him around, Bokuto himself will be in this what I call the hype mode, and in which case he just get buff to himself, all right? Pretty standard. You get 18% buff to your power spy, 27% buff to your strength. However, when the team morale actually ends, you are then going to enter the emo mode where you can't actually spike at all, okay? So you can't do normal spike and you also can't do ultimate spike. However, this does get cleared at the end of rally, so you will never be in the emo mode too long. However, it probably is worth considering when do you actually want to enter team morale, because remember, team morale only lasts for 4 touch points, now 4 net crossings. So basically, if you actually get into a situation where your team morale finish before you can even spike, then what's going to happen is the game is going to force someone else to do the spike instead of Bokuto for you, okay? So it is actually going to be quite important in terms of when you actually want to activate him around, because of the fact that it's only going to be lasting for only 4 touch points. Now, is emo mode such a bad thing? A lot of people will be asking. I would say yes and no. I think in auto it can be a bit annoying. For example, if the game just decides to activate Timura randomly when you have just about to win a point, and then then you have to end up serve, then you actually then receive, then you set, and then you by the time of you needing to spike, your Timura finish, and then you can't spike. That could be very annoying in auto mode. So if you do actually want to play in auto, this can be pretty annoying, I'll have to say. However, if you are able to play it manually, this probably wouldn't matter too much. Now, how big of an impact is the fact that you can't spike? Well, first of all, it's going to depend on whether you want your Bokuto to be the only spike on your field. If it's not going to be the only spike on your team, then it doesn't matter too much, right? Because all you have to do is we will just rotate to the next person to spike. There's vast majority of characters in this game, you're not expecting them to spike every single turn anyway. So in that case, team morale, this emo mode doesn't really impact Bokuto any more than how you will impact a normal spiker. The biggest impact it's actually going to have is only going to be when your Bokuto is actually dupe 6, because when your Bokuto is actually dupe 6, he gets the ability to actually reset his ult cooldown, okay? So if you actually reset your ult cooldown, now you're actually capable of spiking your ultimate twice in a row, in which case then this emo mode, if it actually happen on the wrong timing, that can be pretty annoying. There are still going to be ways of going around that, which I'll talk about in a separate video in the future. We'll actually do a build guide for your version Bokuto. But just for the time being, for the purpose of this video, emo mode is not really that big a deal if you are okay to play it manually, and also you don't have Bokuto at dupe 6, okay? So don't worry too much about this whole emo mode thing. And then also, if you actually do get him to dupe 2, even when you are in emo mode, your teammates actually get 12% buff, okay? So it's not actually such a bad thing. Because now if you actually think about it, you are not supposed to play Bokuto twice in a row or ask him to spike twice in a row anyway. And then for the times when you can't spike because of emo mode, your teammates actually get a 12% buff. So instead, essentially, you actually change Bokuto into a spiker when he needs to, because he can get all of those buffs from his hype mode. And then when he's actually in emo mode, he then transform into a supporter, okay? A passive supporting unit, in which case it's also absolutely fine, okay? And that's kind of the whole idea behind Bokuto. You'll be frequently coming in and out of team morale, which also then means you'll be frequently becoming your spiker for the main team, and then becoming your supporter with a passive ability, and then spiker again, supporter again, spiker again, supporter again, okay? So that's kind of the whole idea behind how to play your version Bokuto. Now let's move on to the SP version of Bokuto. Now his kit is actually really complicated. Like all of the kits for SP characters are like an SA each. So I'm not gonna go through the full details, but I'll kind of just focus on the points, which is actually going to be very different to your Bokuto. Okay. So starting off with his adjustment to the morale system. So unlike you are Bokuto, who is very much played in a way where you are going to frequently enter and also exit team morale all the time. The way SP Bokuto is like completely the opposite end. Instead of being frequently in and out, you are actually going to take much longer to get into team morale. And also, when you're actually inside, you're going to stay there for longer as well, okay? And what that basically means is that in the span of a match, you can probably only get into it probably only like twice every single match. Now, the reason for this is because whilst he get a 40% extra morale at the end of each rally, any other morale gained elsewhere, for example, from your other character skills or memories, etc., they will all be converted to a buff instead of counting towards your team morale, okay? So in order for you to actually build up that 120 morale, basically the only way to do it is basically wait for 3 rallies, pretty much. Now, if you actually think about how long a match typically is, right now all of our matches are best out of 5, which basically means at most there's only going to be 9 rallies. If you take 3 rallies to actually build it up, and then you'll actually be staying inside for 10 crossings. So that's what I mean by once you actually get into team morale, you'll be staying there for longer. It'll be 10 crossing instead of 8 crossing, and also with a slightly higher buff than the normal one. What's end up going to happen is that you basically take 3 rallies to build up your team morale. You'll probably then stay in that team morale for at least 1 or 2 rally, and then you take another 3 rally to build it up again, okay? So the maximum you can do in a best out of 5 match is only going to be best to 5 points match. It's only going to be into team morale twice. Sometimes, depending on how short are the rallies, it may even only end up being able to enter only once per match, okay? So that's kind of why you won't be expected to actually enter team morale much often. But like I said, once you're actually inside, you are able to stay for 10 crossings, and also you can get up to 30% buff, but that's only when you actually max out the skill. At the base level, even at level 1, it's going to be 20% buff, okay? So you're definitely not losing out anything in comparison to the standard morale system. Now, you may be wondering, so what happened to all of those other morale that I'm able to get from my teammates, etc.? So basically, they're all converted to another buff. I can't remember the exact name of the buff because of the translation, etc. But basically, it's just like a permanent buff stack that will be present for your whole team. And basically, every 10 morale point get converted to 1 stack. So now, if you actually think about it, normally you need 120 morale in order to actually activate team morale. This 120 morale now becomes 12 stack. Each stack is able to provide 0.16% buff to all stats. So that's essentially equivalent to 2% buff to all of your stats, okay? Now, this stacks up. So yes, maybe in the first 120 morale, that's only going to be equivalent to a 2% buff. But in the next 120, it's going to be equivalent to 4% buff. And then afterwards, it's going to be 6% buff, etc., okay? So it is actually going to get stronger and stronger as the match goes on. And that basically, obviously, is also going to be slightly different to your standard morale system. Because your standard morale system, what the morale system under UR Bokuto is kind of the same thing. It's either all or nothing, right? You either get a big fat 0, so basically like no buff if you're outside of team morale, or you can get some buff when you're actually inside, but it's both kind of like the extreme end. Whereas this one, you're able to provide some like consistent small buff even when you're outside the team morale throughout. Now, obviously, UR Bokuto is also able to do that when he actually get 2 dupes, but that's required 2 dupes. Whereas SP Bokuto kind of is able to provide that small tiny buff straight out of the box without needing any dupes, okay? Now, what happens in his hive mode? So when you actually do have those team morale, yes, you can only enter it once or twice per match, but once you actually get it, you are able to get insane buff to your stats. Now, I have actually listed this out twice. Once is, it may look similar. One is like power spike stat. Another one says 120% of the stats equivalent to power spike. The reason why those two are listed separately is the 70% are listed first. That's multiplicative. So basically, that basically means if you do like a crit damage, etc., then this will be applied to that. However, the last 120 or the second 120 number I'll have listed here, that's only addition. Okay, so regardless whether you crit or you didn't crit, it's always going to be a flat 120. It won't be multiplied by anything else. Whereas the first one, that 70% will actually be multiplied. So that's the only reason why I listed them out separately. But essentially, just think of it as like a super giga buffed spike when you're actually in that team morale. And because your team morale is going to be for 10 net crossing, this is going to apply to more than just O. It's also going to be applying to your normal mode, okay? Normal spike. And that also brings us to the emo mode. Now, the emo mode, once again, for the SP Bokuto, it's going to be different to the UR Bokuto. UR Bokuto, you basically get into your emo mode when the team morale ends, and it'll be cleared at the end of the rally, okay? However, for the beach emo mode, what's going to happen is that you get it straight off at the start of the match, and also whenever you use an ult. And it's only going to be cleared when you actually enter team morale. Now, if you actually think about how long it takes to enter Team Morale, and also when you're actually inside Team Morale, the fact that it actually lasts for 10 net crossing, you would know. For vast majority of the time, unlike you or Bokuto, who will be who will be always in and out of like between hype mode and emo mode, like constantly transition between the two. SP Bokuto is actually going to stay in the mode for a very long time, okay? He will actually stay in beach emo mode for a very long time because it takes ages for him to build up the morale again to come out of it, and also it takes ages when he's actually inside Team Morale for that 10 net crossing to actually finish. However, the added value of this emo mode in comparison to the UR one is that unlike the UR one where you can't spike at all, so basically you can only do like passive support when you are in emo mode for the UR Bokuto. For the SP one, whilst you can't ult, you can still use your normal spike, and in fact, it's going to get some extra buff for that normal spark as well, and it's also going to give you an extra 3 stacks of your own buff. So the idea is that, and also remember, because your team morale lasts for a really long time, this lasts for 10 net crossings, it's very likely even after using your ult, you're still going to be in hype mode. So essentially you'll be in hype mode and also the emo mode at the same time, okay? And when that happens, what's going to happen is that you would then be able to basically get like a huge giga buff normal spike, and that huge giga buff normal spike, first of all, it's going to be essentially equivalent to like another character's ultimate, so you can definitely use his normal spike and think of that as an ultimate from other people, and also it's going to give yourself even further buff stat so that you're able to continue buff yourself further. So that's kind of the idea behind SP Bokuto's emo mode. And then lastly, when you get dupe, his buff just gets increased even higher. A lot of the buff is actually going to be scaling based on how many stacks you have, but at the highest level, you can get like 150% extra strength and another 100% extra strength, which is scaling off your awareness. That's a whooping 250% extra crit damage, and that basically makes SP Bokuto the hardest hitting spiker in this game as of now, okay? So that's basically the idea of SP Bokuto. So hopefully from this video, you guys can already tell the difference between the two. If you want me to do a quick recap, I will think of UR Bokuto more as a kind of like a hybrid between both a supporter and also spiker, because he is actually able to offer a lot of passive support ability from the fact that you're able to frequently enter your team morale and therefore give a 40% buff for your whole team. And also if you're able to get it to dupe 2, even when you're outside team morale, you're able to provide that constant 12% buff as well, okay? So he definitely have that consistent buffing ability going on, and also obviously when he do actually spike in hype mode, he's able to have a pretty strong spike as well. And if you do actually happen to get to dupe 6, then he can be doing a lot more DPS for your team and then transition more to like a main spiker. But even without that, he can be like a hybrid of both spiker and also like a support at the same time. Then if we switch to the other side, we take a look at SP Bokuto. Yes, he is still able to provide some passive buff. However, that buff is pretty minimal in comparison to this, right? If I take a look at this is a constant 12% buff. In order for me to get enough stacks, in order to become 12% buff, I need like 75 stacks, which is going to take forever for me to actually build that up by himself, okay? So that's kind of why, yes, he is able to provide some buff, but nowhere near as nice as what the UR version of Bokuto is able to provide. However, in return, you get literally the hardest hitting ultimate attack in this game. Like there's no comparison, and even his normal attack is going to be comparable to ultimate attack. Especially that's more probably towards the late of the match when you have to have all of those buff stacks stacked up. But yeah, early game you can probably still rotate and use other people's spike. However, late game, once you actually have enough buff, you can literally just use him to spike all the way, even with his normal attack, and that's kind of the idea. And then obviously from a team perspective, team building perspective, those two also mean different things. If you actually play UR Bokuto, you'll be frequently coming in and out of team morale all the time, so you can also plan your team around that. Whereas if you actually going via SP Bokuto, you will be expected to not enter team morale much at all. However, if you do actually end up in there, you'll be staying there for a long time, and also your team will actually get stronger as a whole as the match goes on, because all of your consistent small buff are actually going to stack up. So towards the end or the last few rallies of the match, your whole team is actually going to get very, very strong buffs. However, it will take a long warming up period in order for you to actually reach all those stacks, okay? But yeah, hopefully this can give you guys a few insights in terms of the difference between the two version Bokuto and also their playstyle. Let me know what you guys think and also which version Bokuto you are planning to summon for.